The air in the lawyer's office tasted like dust and old paper, thick with unspoken resentments. My brother, Mark, sat across the polished mahogany table, a smirk playing on his lips, tracing the rim of a water glass with a finger that looked too long, too delicate for the malice it contained. Sunlight, weak and watery through the tall, indifferent windows, caught the motes dancing in the stale air. Outside, the city rushed by, oblivious to the silent, agonizing theater unfolding within these four walls. Inside, time had stopped. Or maybe it was just stretching, thin and brittle, towards the inevitable break. My hands, clasped in my lap, felt cold and alien. I could feel the tremor start deep in my core, a low hum that threatened to vibrate through my skin. Mark cleared his throat, a small, performative sound. He leaned back, crossing one leg over the other, the expensive fabric of his suit trousers pulling taut. He caught my eye and the smirk widened, a silent, cruel promise. The lawyer, Mr. Stern, a man whose face seemed permanently etched with the world's accumulated weariness, adjusted his spectacles. He picked up a thick folder, the kind that promised finality. This was it. The reading. The moment where my parents' last wishes, their final judgment on our lives, would be laid bare. And I knew, with a certainty that clawed at my insides, what Mark expected, what he had worked so hard to ensure. Nothing for me. Let me know where you're watching from and what time it is. And if you haven't already, please subscribe. It helps me more than you know. Growing up, the lines were drawn early. Mark was the golden child. Effortless charm, academic success, the right friends, the right hobbies. I was the other one. Quiet, artistic, preferring books and solitude to social graces. Our parents, bless their complicated hearts, didn't explicitly choose favorites, but the scales were always tipped. Mark's achievements were celebrated with fanfare. Mine were met with polite, often distracted, nods. It wasn't a sudden, dramatic rejection. It was a slow, steady erosion, like water wearing away stone. 1,000 tiny moments stacking up over years, building a wall between me and the warmth of the family center. Mark knew this. He exploited it with a casual, almost unconscious cruelty that was far more effective than outright malice. He'd make small, pointed jokes about my lack of ambition, my unrealistic dreams, my inability to handle real life. He'd subtly undermine my efforts, twist my words, paint me as flaky, unreliable, emotionally unstable to our parents. He was the dependable son, the one who would carry on the family name, the family business, the family legacy. I was the liability, the dreamer, the one who would probably just squander anything given to her. I saw it happening, felt the distance growing, but I didn't know how to stop it. Every attempt to connect, to bridge the gap, felt like running headfirst into a brick wall built of his smug indifference and my parents' weary acceptance of the status quo. It became easier to simply exist on the periphery, building a life for myself that didn't require their approval, a life built on my own shaky foundations, far from the gilded cage Mark occupied. My desire wasn't for their money, not really. It was for their belief, for a sign that they saw me, truly saw me, and valued me not for what I could inherit or continue, but for who I was. That was the inheritance I craved. And that was the one Mark had successfully convinced them I didn't deserve. The call from Mr. Stern had been brief, formal. My parents had passed within weeks of each other. A cruel twist of fate, or maybe a final, shared surrender after decades intertwined. The grief hit me like a physical blow, a wave that threatened to pull me under. Despite everything, they were my parents, the anchors of my world, however distant they had become. But beneath the grief, a cold dread settled. The will. I knew Mark would make his move. He wouldn't just inherit. He would ensure I was formally, legally erased. The days leading up to the reading were a blur of logistics, hushed phone calls, the sterile smell of funeral homes. Mark handled everything, freezing me out of decisions, making it clear I was an auxiliary, a distant relative rather than a daughter. He spoke to me only when necessary, his voice dripping with a false sympathy that felt more like contempt. "Don't worry," he'd said, his hand briefly, coldly on my arm. "I'll make sure everything is taken care of. Mom and Dad worried about you, you know. Your unconventional choices," the implication hung heavy in the air. My choices had disqualified me. Disqualified me from their love, from their legacy, from anything he deemed worthy. He was already writing me out of the story. The tension escalated with each passing day. Every interaction was a veiled battleground. He'd talk about the future of the family business, about preserving Mom and Dad's legacy, always looking pointedly at me, as if I were a ghost haunting the halls of our childhood home. He wouldn't let me have certain photos, claiming they were needed for the estate. He even tried to get me to sign a document stating I wouldn't contest the will before I had even seen it, under the guise of streamlining the process during a difficult time. I refused, a small, shaky act of defiance that earned me a glare colder than any I'd received before. The crisis wasn't just about the money. It was about the final, legal confirmation of my worth, or lack thereof, in my family's eyes, and the certainty that Mark would weaponize it. Mr. Stern cleared his throat again, the sound echoing in the quiet room. "We are here today," he began, his voice a low drone, "for the reading of the last will and testament of he named my parents." My heart pounded against my ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. Mark shifted in his seat, his posture radiating anticipation. Mr. Stern went through the formalities, the identification of the deceased, the date the will was signed. He began reading. The first few clauses were standard, instructions for debts, final expenses. Then he got to the bequests. Mark was named executor. No surprise there. Then came the division of assets. The family home, the one filled with 50 years of memories, Mark. The shares in the family business, built by my grandfather, expanded by my father, Mark. The significant financial accounts, Mark. The cars, the art, the everything, Mark. My breath hitched. It was worse than I'd imagined, starker. Not a single mention of me. Not a single piece of furniture, not a book, not even a sentimental trinket. It was as if I had never existed. I felt a cold, nauseating wave wash over me. It wasn't just the money. It was the absolute, brutal erasure. The lawyer continued, his voice monotonous, reading clause after clause that solidified Mark's inheritance, his control, his absolute triumph. He read the residual clause, the one that covered anything not specifically mentioned. To my son, Mark Thomas Sterling, any and all remaining assets, property, and possessions, it was done. Final. Complete. My eyes burned, but I refused to let the tears fall. Not here. Not in front of him. Mark shifted again, and I could feel his eyes on me, waiting for me to break. A tiny, almost imperceptible smile touched his lips. This was his moment. The culmination of a lifetime of subtle sabotage. Then Mr. Stern reached the part one dreaded most. The explanation. The justification for my exclusion. Mark leaned forward, ready for this vindication. My parents included a statement here, Mr. Stern read, his voice still flat, regarding their decision for the division of their estate. This was it. The public airing of my supposed failings. I brace myself. They state that their son, Mark, has always demonstrated sound financial judgment, a dedication to the family business, and a responsible approach to managing assets. They express confidence in his ability to honor their legacy and provide stability for the future. Mark preened, a quiet, arrogant inhalation of air. Regarding their daughter, Mr. Stern continued, and I flinched internally, waiting for the blow. They express concern over her chosen path, which they describe as unpredictable and lacking in conventional security. They state that while they love her, they believe a substantial inheritance would not be managed wisely and could potentially be detrimental to her personal growth and independence. The words landed like stones. Predictable. Cruel. Mark's narrative, parroted back from beyond the grave. It wasn't just that they hadn't given me anything, it was why. Because I wasn't like Mark. Because I chose a different path. Because they didn't trust me. A bitter, acrid taste filled my mouth. This was the deepest cut, the confirmation that their love, conditional as it was, came with an asterisk, a judgment I could never escape. Mark let out a small, soft sound, a triumphant puff of air. "See," his posture screamed. "I told you." They knew. He leaned back again, the smirk now fully formed, ugly and triumphant. "She doesn't deserve a penny," he murmured, just loud enough for me to hear, his eyes fixed on my face, searching for the crack, the visible sign of my defeat. The air in the room seemed to thicken, suffocating me. All my life, I had tried to prove them wrong, to show them my path had value, that I had value. And in their final act, they had sided with Mark, validated his judgment, and left me standing in the cold, empty-handed and heartbroken. The world outside the window seemed impossibly distant, the sounds of traffic muffled, like sounds heard underwater. I felt myself shrinking, becoming smaller, disappearing. This wasn't just a financial loss. It was the loss of a fundamental validation I had craved my entire life. All seemed lost. The future stretched before me, bleak and uncertain, shadowed by the long, dark confirmation of my inadequacy in the eyes of the two people who were supposed to love me unconditionally. But then, as Mark basked in his victory, his eyes still fixed on me, a strange calmness settled over me. The stinging in my eyes subsided. The trembling stopped. It wasn't resignation, it was something else. A cold, clear space opened up in my mind. He thought he had won. He thought this was the end. He had spent years weaving his web, manipulating perception, chipping away at my place in the family until, in his eyes, I was nothing. And it seemed he had succeeded. The will was red. The exclusion was clear. His mocking whisper hung in the air, the final insult. "She doesn't deserve a penny," the lawyer, Mr. Stern, hadn't moved. He still held the folder. His expression was still the same mask of professional weariness. He wasn't packing up. He wasn't closing the folder. Mark's words, delivered with such absolute certainty, bounced around the silent room. Deserve. The word struck me differently now. Did he deserve it? All of it? The house built on our grandparents' dreams, the business founded on their hard work, the money saved over decades? What had he built? What had he sacrificed? Only the truth. Only genuine connection. His entire existence seemed built on tearing others down to make himself appear taller. He had built his triumph on my perceived failure. And in that moment of absolute clarity, watching his smug face, hearing his victorious whisper, I knew he was wrong. He was fundamentally, spectacularly wrong. He saw the will as the final score, the definitive statement. But what if? What if the game wasn't over? What if there was another chapter he hadn't accounted for? I met his gaze, and for the first time, I didn't look away. I didn't flinch. I didn't show the heartbreak that was a dull ache beneath the surface. I just looked at him, steadily, calmly. And in that look, I think he saw something that unsettled him. The smirk faltered, just for a fraction of a second. He couldn't read me anymore. The victim he expected to see, the one who would collapse in tears or anger, wasn't there. In her place was someone else. Someone quiet, watchful, waiting. Mr. Stern cleared his throat again, this time with a different note, less formal, more deliberate. He adjusted his spectacles again. That, he said, his voice cutting through the silence, is the last will and testament. He paused. Mark relaxed slightly, settling back into his victorious pose. However, Mr. Stern continued, and the single word hung in the air, heavy with unforeseen possibility, that is not the entirety of your parents' final arrangements. Mark froze. The smirk vanished, as if wiped away by an unseen hand. His eyes narrowed, flicking from me to Mr. Stern. What do you mean? He demanded, his voice sharp, losing its smooth edge. The will is the will. It's all there. Mr. Stern remained impassive. A will, he stated, his voice regaining its formal tone, deals with the probate estate. Your parents, however, made separate arrangements for a significant portion of their assets outside of the probate process. He reached for another, smaller folder beside the first one. Mark's gaze was fixed on that folder, his earlier confidence replaced by a flicker of apprehension. Mr. Stern opened the second folder. Several years ago, he began, reading from the documents, Your parents established an irrevocable living trust, Mark scoffed, a nervous sound. A trust? For what? A rainy day fund? A few extra bits and pieces? He waved a dismissive hand. It can't be much if it wasn't in the main will. Mr. Stern's gaze lifted, meeting Mark's directly. On the contrary, Mr. Sterling, the assets transferred into this trust over the subsequent years constitute the vast majority of your parents' wealth. The property detailed in the will, he gestured to the first folder, while significant, is a relatively small percentage of the total estate. The air grew thick again, but this time with Mark's dawning horror. His face, just moments ago smug, was now draining of color. No, he whispered, the single word a raw, guttural sound of disbelief. That's impossible. Mr. Stern ignored him and continued reading the trust document. The trust was established with a primary beneficiary and terms specifically designed to ensure the long-term security and independence of that beneficiary. It is legally separate from the probate estate and not subject to the same challenges or public record. He read the name of the primary beneficiary. My name, my full name, stated clearly, unequivocally. Mark made a choking sound. His eyes, wide and frantic, darted between me and Mr. Stern. The terms of the trust, Mr. Stern read on, his voice like a gavel striking wood, grant the primary beneficiary sole discretion over the trust's assets upon the passing of the settlers, my parents. These assets include, but are not limited to, he listed them, and the words hit Mark like a physical blow. Vast sums of money in offshore accounts he didn't know existed, properties held under different names, a portfolio of investments managed privately for decades, assets that dwarfed the family business and the house. The inheritance Mark thought was everything was merely the tip of an iceberg he hadn't known existed. And the bulk of it, the real fortune, belonged to me. The plot twist wasn't just that I got something, it was that I got everything, and Mark got the leftovers he thought were the main course. The irony was a bitter, satisfying poison. He had been so focused on manipulating the public will, on ensuring my exclusion from the visible estate, that he had been completely blindsided by the hidden, untouchable fortune my parents had squirreled away, explicitly for me, through this private trust. His scheming, his subtle poisoning of my parents' view of me, his gloating whisper about me not deserving a penny, it had all been built on a fundamental misunderstanding of the game he was playing. He thought he was stealing a few coins. He had unknowingly pointed me towards a treasure chest while distracting himself with pocket change. He froze, utterly and completely, the smirk replaced by a look of pure, unadulterated shock and disbelief, his face a mask of sudden, terrifying emptiness. He had not just lost, he had been played. The silence that followed felt infinite. Mark sat rigid, his eyes fixed on Mr. Stern as if the lawyer were speaking a foreign language. The blood had completely drained from his face, leaving it a pasty, unhealthy white. His mouth hung slightly open. He looked less like a man who had just lost an inheritance, and more like someone who had seen a ghost. Or perhaps, more accurately, seen himself for the first time, naked and vulnerable. He had banked everything on the visible, the controllable, the narrative he had so carefully constructed. He had been so certain of my parents' predictable disappointment in me, so confident that his own performance as the dutiful, responsible son would secure his future, that he had missed the quiet, deliberate path my parents had forged outside his view. He had underestimated their complexity, their potential for subtlety, and perhaps their quiet understanding of his true nature versus mine. He thought the will was the finish line. It was merely a distraction. He finally found his voice, a hoarse croak. This is a joke, he stammered, pushing back from the table, the chair scraping loudly against the floor. You're lying. That trust. It's fake. He pointed a trembling finger at me. She can't have that. It's impossible. I'm the heir. I'm the one who stayed, who managed everything. She did nothing. His voice rose to a near shout, cracking with desperation. Mr. Stern calmly closed the trust folder. The trust is legally binding, Mr. Sterling. It was established correctly, funded appropriately, and is currently managed by a corporate trustee as per its terms. I merely hold the documentation as the settler's attorney. Your sister is the named beneficiary, he paused, allowing the weight of the words to sink in. And as an irrevocable trust, its terms are exceptionally difficult, if not impossible, to challenge or alter. Mark turned his frantic gaze on me. You knew, he accused, his eyes blazing with a sudden, terrifying rage. You planned this. You manipulated them. I met his gaze steadily. I didn't know, I said, my voice quiet, clear. Not any of this, and it was true. I had braced myself for nothing. This was beyond anything I could have imagined. It felt less like a victory and more like the earth shifting beneath my feet. A profound, unsettling revelation about the people who had raised me and the brother I thought I knew. Mark lunged forward, slamming his hands onto the table. I'll contest it. I'll sue you. I'll prove you somehow tricked them. Mr. Stern didn't flinch. You are free to consult with your own counsel, Mr. Sterling. But I assure you, the trust was drafted and executed with extreme care to withstand challenge. Your parents were very clear in their intentions regarding its purpose. He didn't elaborate on the intentions, but the implication hung in the air. My parents knew Mark well enough to build an impenetrable fortress around the money they wanted me to have. His own behavior had likely been the very reason for the trust structure and secrecy. His greed, his need for control, his predictable reaction to my potential inheritance, they had built a countermeasure against it. He had been so busy digging my grave that he hadn't seen the solid ground they were building under my feet. He stumbled back, running a hand through his hair, his chest heaving. He looked broken, undone. Not by grief, but by the shattering of his carefully constructed reality, the failure of his lifelong manipulation. The silence returned, heavy and complete, save for Mark's ragged breathing. He stood there, staring at the table, at the folders, at the ruins of his expectations. I watched him, feeling a complex mix of emotions. There was no triumphant joy, only a deep, weary sadness. Sadness for the family we never truly were, for the damage he had inflicted on himself, for the parents who felt they had to go to such lengths to protect one child from the other. The victory felt hollowed out by the wreckage of our relationship. The weight of the inheritance felt less like freedom and more like a burden, a tangible symbol of a love that had been expressed in the most unconventional and ultimately heartbreaking way. He finally looked up, his eyes meeting mine one last time. There was no longer rage, just a chilling, empty despair. He turned and walked out of the office without another word, leaving behind only the lingering scent of his defeat. Mr. Stern watched him go, then turned back to me. He offered a small, sad smile. Your parents were remarkable people, he said softly. More complex than many gave them credit for. He gathered the documents. There's a great deal to go over. The trust, its assets, the administration. It's a significant responsibility, I nodded, still trying to process it all. The shock was beginning to wear off, replaced by the immense, daunting reality of what had just happened. I hadn't just inherited money. I had inherited a secret history, a final, silent statement from my parents, and the irreversible consequence of my brother's actions. The days that followed were a blur of meetings with Mr. Stern, conversations with financial advisors, and the quiet, relentless work of absorbing the reality of my new situation. Mark disappeared from my life, at least for a while. Mr. Stern's prediction about his attempts to contest the trust proved accurate, but futile. The legal fortress my parents had built was impenetrable. His lawyers eventually advised him to drop it, leaving him with the probate estate, the house, the business, the smaller accounts, a substantial inheritance by any normal standard, but a pittance compared to the vast wealth locked away in the trust, untouchable by him. The irony wasn't lost on me. He got the legacy he craved, the business, the house, the visible signs of success, but I got the true security, the quiet power, the freedom from ever needing anything from anyone again, especially not from him. There was no grand confrontation after the office, no dramatic showdown. Just his retreat into wounded pride and legal maneuvering that led nowhere. My victory was silent, private, legally absolute. But it didn't feel like a win in the way I might have imagined. It felt heavy. The money was freedom, yes, but it was also a constant reminder of the cost. The cost of our family, shattered by ambition and mistrust. The cost of a love so complicated it required secret trusts to protect one child from the other. I thought about my parents constantly. Their quiet foresight, their deep understanding of Mark's character, their complex feelings about mine. They hadn't just given me money. They had given me validation, a posthumous declaration that they saw my struggles, understood the landscape I was navigating, and believed in my ability to eventually stand on my own, even if their public pronouncements seemed otherwise. The trust felt like a quiet apology for the ways they couldn't protect me when they were alive, or perhaps for the subtle ways they had enabled Mark. It was a paradox, a source of immense privilege born from deep familial dysfunction. I moved slowly, deliberately, beginning to understand the weight of responsibility that came with such wealth. I didn't want to be the person Mark accused me of being, the one who would squander it. I wanted to honor the quiet trust my parents had placed in me with this final, secret act. The business Mark inherited eventually struggled under his management. Turns out inheriting success is easier than building it. The house felt empty, too large for him alone. He was left with the symbols of power, while I held the substance. But my days weren't filled with lavish spending or grand displays. They were filled with quiet reflection, with the daunting task of figuring out what kind of life to build with this unexpected foundation. What did it mean to be free from financial worry, but burdened by the knowledge of why that freedom was necessary? The aftermath wasn't a triumphant parade. It was a silent reckoning, a recognition of the bitter truth. Sometimes, the people who are supposed to love you most are the ones you need the most protection from. My parents gave me that protection, in the end, in a way I never could have predicted. And Mark, consumed by his own narrative, never saw it coming until it was too late. The silence that settled between us was more final than any shouted argument could have been. He got the house, the business, the public face of a legacy. I got the quiet, invisible wealth, the proof that I was seen, and the heavy, complicated truth about the family I came from. It wasn't the happy ending I might have dreamed of as a child, but it was an ending. A stark, undeniable conclusion to a lifetime of subtle conflict. And standing on the other side of it, I realized the greatest inheritance wasn't the money at all. It was the understanding, the clarity, the knowledge that I could stand, finally, entirely on my own 2 feet, in the quiet confidence of knowing that while I might not have been the golden child, I was the one they ultimately chose to protect. If this story hit close to home, I'd love to hear your version. Drop a comment with where you're listening from and what time it is. Thanks for being here. Subscribing helps bring more of these to life.